It's another snowy day here in Utah. It's after Christmas. Tomorrow is New Year's Eve, and I'm on the banks of the Provo River here up in the Heber Valley. I'm going to photograph here and talk to you about focus stacking. Focus stacking is where you focus on various points in the composition and then merge them all together in Adobe Photoshop or a similar program to get a totally sharp image from front to back. It's really the best way to go. If you're photographing something that has subjects up close and in the distance, and you want to be able to get everything in focus in that, shooting at f/22 will help, but it won't make it perfect. I didn't touch on this in my last video about depth of field and aperture, but when you're shooting at f/22, you're not getting the maximum sharpness of your lens. The maximum sharpness of most lenses is around f/8, f/11, somewhere in that realm. It depends on the lens and the focal length and all that jazz. When you shoot at f/22, you can get everything reasonably in focus in front of and behind the focus plane, but it will not be as tack sharp as it should be. That's where focus stacking comes in. So in this composition, I've got a bush in the foreground, and I also have the river going on into the distance through the trees. If I want it to be all in focus, I need to focus on the bush, I need to focus in the middle, and I need to focus in the back. Part of the trick to shooting your focus stacked images is to not use f/22. You don't want to have such a deep depth of field that you can't tell the difference between images. You want to shoot at your lens's maximum sharpness, which is usually, like I said, f/8 to f/11. This is my 28-70 2.8 lens, and I'm going to shoot with it at f/8. I'm going to start with focusing on the bush. Now notice how the background is slightly out of focus. Now if I come up and I focus in the middle out there, now the foreground is slightly out of focus. I am going to mention that there is a slight breeze blowing this bush in front, which will affect the sharpness of the image when you go to blend these. I might get a little bit of ghosting is what I call it, and I'll have to Photoshop that out. But generally this will work. Now I'm going to focus all the way in back, basically at infinity, and take the shot. Now if you look at that and we bring it in to 100%, look at how out of focus the bush in front is, even though the background and most of the middle ground is nice and sharp. If we look at the middle ground image and zoom into 100%, the middle is fairly in focus, the background is fairly in focus, but the foreground is still quite out of focus, though it's sharper. If we go to where I focused on the very foreground and zoom in on it at 100%, it's nice and sharp. But the middle ground and the background is out of focus. These are the conditions you need to really get focus stacking at its best. Something in the foreground you can focus on, something in the middle, and then in the distance. It doesn't work really well if all your subject is out there, depends on the lens, but somewhere out there towards infinity. Focus stacking won't matter, it won't work. You might as well just shoot at f/8 and call it good. Also, make a habit of checking your focus by going to the preview and zooming in. You can do it in live preview. I also will go to the image and just zoom in on it and check the focus at various points to make sure I'm getting it right. There's nothing worse than getting home and finding that your images aren't sharp because you weren't focusing in the right spot. So take the time to really look at what you're doing, look at the composition, and check your focus by zooming in, scrolling around, and making sure you've got everything how you want it. So the next step to this is take you back to my studio and show you how to merge these images in Photoshop to combine into one image where it will all be sharp from front to back. If you don't use Photoshop, you use something else, the principles are the same. So I'll see you back in my studio in just a few minutes, which will actually be quite a while from now because that's just the way it is going to happen. But hey, what the heck, in the TV world, it'll just be a minute. Well, it's the next morning. I'm back here in my studio. Yeah. This is my studio. You see my drum set back there and some of my guitars. I also do all my photo editing and video stuff here. Just all one big workstation. So let me show you how we're going to take these 3 separate images and put them all together in Photoshop to make them one image that is sharp from front to back. This is Lightroom. If you don't have Lightroom and Photoshop and you don't use anything else, you've got to get something to do this kind of work. Lightroom and Photoshop are not that expensive. I pay under 10 bucks a month for the Lightroom Classic and the Photoshop. It's really not expensive. It is all in the cloud per se, so you don't just load it to your computer and work offline. That's one of the drawbacks to it. But it's really the only way that Adobe is doing this now, so it just kind of is what it is. So in Lightroom, I've got these 3 images starred. I'm going to select the first one and select, so all 3 are selected. Then I'm going to right-click. Now, some people might think, oh, well, they're stacking right there. Let's use that. That's not how it works that I know of. I'm not an expert on Photoshop on Lightroom. There's a lot of people out there that know a lot more about it than I do. I know what I know and I do what I do, and that's just the way I am. It's the same thing with my instruments. I'm not a musician that plays lots of other people's songs. I write my own stuff, I play my own stuff, and that's what I do. I do play the drums to just about anything, and I do know some people's stuff, but it's not really where I go. So what you're going to do is go to Edit In, and you're going to go to Open as Layers in Photoshop. I'm going to click on that. I don't have Photoshop open, so this is going to take a second for it to open it up. So it takes a second here in Photoshop. It opens them all up individually as layers. So here's the layers right here. That's all 3 of those images as a layer. You want to click on them all, select them all, like that. I clicked the top one, hit Shift, and went down and clicked the bottom one. Then I'm going to go over here to Edit, and I'm going to go to Align Layers, and I'm going to select that. Now I'm going to just, you can change some of the stuff if you want. I'm just going to go with Auto. I'm not going to turn on vignette removal or anything like that. I'm going to hit OK. That's going to take those layers and looking at, it's going to align them, because when you focus, it changes the focal length of the lens a little bit. You'll notice this sometimes from one image to the next when you're focus stacking and you look at them, there's a slight shift. That's what this is doing, is realigning them. Now, if you look, I've got a white line in places right there along the edge where it aligned them, but it had to shift them a little bit to make them align up everywhere else. So you're going to notice a little bit of a white line around them in spots. You're going to have to crop it just a little bit if you've got that. The next thing I'm going to do, I still have all those 3 layers selected. I'm going to go to Edit, and I'm going to go down here to Auto Blend Layers, select it, and you've got Panorama or Stack. I'm going to do Stack Images, and I'm going to leave Seamless Tone and Colors turned on. You can turn that off. You can also do content aware fill. If I do content aware fill, it'll fill in that white line, but it might not make it look perfect. So I just ignore it and crop a tiny bit. So I'm going to hit OK with the stack images selected. I might mention something too. If you're only running on like 16 gigs of RAM on your computer, and if you don't know what that means, you should. Photoshop and Lightroom hog a lot of RAM, a lot of memory space, and I've upgraded to 32. I need to go up to 64. I've just got to order 232 sticks and upgrade, but it's really beneficial to have a fast computer. You can run on the minimal as it says, but you'll find things taking a while to process. So now that's processed and merged those all. Let's zoom in here up to 100%, and look at this. So here's the foreground that I focused on. There might be a little bit of ghosting where the breeze moved. Here's an example right here. You see how that one is just a little bit blurry. This one right here is a little bit blurry, and even up through here. That's because the breeze was blowing that. There's not a whole lot you can do at that point. I would prefer, while I'm shooting, to wait for there to be no breeze, and then I will do the 3, 4, 5 exposures, whatever I need to do to focus stack it. Your camera also probably has the ability for you to focus in one spot, like in the foreground, and then it will focus out in various increments and take like 5, 6. You can set it to do what you want. 5, 6 different images focusing out to infinity. That is a really good way to go, but it wouldn't fix this. This is an issue where the breeze was blowing, and so those things are moved from one shot to the next. If you sit and wait for the breeze to stop blowing, you can wait a long time, but just do it, and then have your camera set on automatic to just, you take the one shot and it goes click, 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 and takes them all quickly. You'll get less of this. But notice how sharp this bush is in front now that I've stacked these. Notice the mid-ground right back in here behind the bush is sharp, and the background is sharp. So that's the basics of focus stacking. You could focus in more points than just 3. You can do 2. I mean, if it's a composition where you only need to focus on the foreground and then on the background, you can get away with 2. You could do 8 or 10 if you need to. It totally depends on what you're doing. Something else I didn't point out is it really depends on the focal length of your lens. I shot this at 28 millimeters, which has a fairly wide depth of field anyway. The wider angle lens you're going to go, the more in focus everything will look behind and in front of what you're focused on, generally speaking. When I focused on the bush, everything was out of focus. But when I focused in the middle, the background was in pretty good focus too. I did dial it in tighter by going into my live preview, zooming in and manually focusing it to get it right. So I hope you enjoyed this and I explained it simply. I'm trying to keep things as simplistic as possible. If you're new to photography and you're trying to figure this stuff out, terminology and people talking over your head can be a big problem. I'm short, so I have a problem with people talking over my head all the time. But I'm so bright, my mom calls me son. Sorry about the glare on my head from the lights. It just kind of is what it is. So get outside and have fun. Get your camera out and photograph, even in a snowstorm. Go out and photograph and take photographs of anything that catches your interest and practice. Getting good at something is all about practice, 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 practice. Even people that have been doing it for 35 years like I have need to stay practiced, need to keep going out and learning. I'm learning new stuff all the time. Stuff changes. Photography has changed so much over the years. I'm constantly having to learn. Get better. That's what I'm trying to help people understand, is you can get better. It takes some ingenuity. It takes an eye to be able to compose an image. I'm going to get to that in my next video about composition, how to compose an image, and the various rules, like the rule of thirds. I'm going to get to that, so stay tuned for my next video. Thanks for watching, and happy trails. One day I was sitting in a pizzeria by myself, eating a pizza and a Coke, and this lady walks over and sits down at my table. She says, "Can I ask you a question?" And I'm like, "Okay." I'm like, "Great. What's going to happen here?" And she leans across the table. She says, "What do bald guys put on their head to make it so shiny?" And I looked at her, and I had actually had somebody else ask me this years ago, so I had a prepared answer. I looked at her and I said, "Well, I use a special combination of surfboard wax, snowboard wax, and turtle wax." And she said, "Really?" And I said, "Yeah, the surfboard wax makes it smell like root beer. Do you want to smell?" And I leaned forward right over the table, and she sniffed the top of my head. I was just kind of shocked. And I looked up, and her husband was standing over there, and he was just shaking his head like, and he mouthed, "I'm sorry."